I have been in the more or less the same frame of mind for the past 40 years. The difference is that perhaps some people, and only some, I don't think it's everybody yet by any means, are beginning to slowly, some to a greater extent and some to a lesser extent, are beginning to slowly wake up and see the world and see reality for what it is. I haven't changed my opinions. I have not changed my perspective in 40 years, not at all. Let me share something with you. Exactly 40 years ago, give or take, I was a young, what's called in Hebrew an avrech. I was a young married yeshiva student. Okay, and I had what's called in Hebrew a hevrutha. A hevrutha is a study partner. I studied with this person for practical purposes for about 10 years together. We studied together, and actually perhaps even more. And and we were like-minded in many ways, and we began to note. So we're talking about, according to the Gregorian calendar, we're talking, as I said, 40 years ago. So we're talking 1983, 1984. In the Hebrew calendar, it's Tafshin Mem Gimel, Tafshin Mem Daled. And we just were listening to the news, I suppose, like everybody else. Israelis are famously newsaholics. And we were just, like anyone else, listen to the news a few times a day. And one, excuse me, and one began to notice that it probably began actually a little bit before that, but it was around that time, I think, that I began to take more notice of it, that you heard several times a day on the news that rocks were thrown at a car driven by Jews in this part of the country, in that part of the country, usually in Yudan Shomron, Judea and Samaria, usually, but not always. It also could happen sometimes in the Galil and the Galilee, etc. Also in general Yerushalayim, Greater Jerusalem area. That was one thing. Another thing was, and sometimes these rock throwing attacks led to serious injury and even death. I remember distinctly a certain young woman being killed by a rock that was thrown at her car. But there are probably many such instances, but one sticks out in my mind. I can't remember her name, I'm afraid. And around the same time, and also over the following years, it began to become more and more frequent. The phenomenon of, and of course, it goes without saying, when I say rocks were thrown, I omitted to mention that rocks don't throw themselves, that rocks do not fly through the air, defying the laws of the law of gravity, but they were thrown by someone. This became a very frequent and essentially not just a daily occurrence, but many times a day, and it increased over the years. The other phenomenon was Jews being attacked with knives, being stabbed by Arabs. This was, again, something that was on the news, and it became a very frequent occurrence. So this Hevrutha, this study partner of mine, and I were very perturbed by this. And we were even more perturbed by the fact that all our colleagues and friends in the yeshiva, in this rabbinical seminary where we were studying with hundreds of people, no one seemed to be bothered by it or just talking about it. It didn't seem to be an issue, which seemed a bit strange to us. So we decided that, well, it must be because people are simply not aware of what's going on. They're not aware of the frequency, the statistics. So we began to keep a log. We began to, whenever we listened, either of us listened to the news, we would just jot down in a notebook the date on this particular radio station. Was always a radio. I didn't have a TV. So on this radio station, on such and such a time, this was reported. And he did the same thing, and we collated our efforts, and we built it into a daily log over a period of a week, over a period of a month, etc. And we showed it to people in the yeshiva, in this place we were studying. And strangely enough, people just sort of shrugged, as if, that's just like, as if we're remarking on the weather, because that's how people were relating to it. It was just not something you discussed. And then I won't bore you with all the details. We even went to certain people more active in terms of political activism, etc., and tried to get this information out. And it was in fact published in a certain fashion. But what we reluctantly had to admit to ourselves was that people didn't want to hear about it. Over the years, I also began to understand why people didn't want to hear about it, because people wanted to believe the lie that you can live with these people in peace and things will work themselves out. They just didn't want to hear it because it didn't fit the
narrative.
The narrative, exactly. So from that time to this, that's just one small example, one small facet of the entire reality. It's not just rocks, it's not just knives. It's become, as you know, much more over the years. But it's Israel's strategic situation. I've been aware of this for many years, has become more and more precarious. And again, it's not something that people want to talk about. But now, since Shmini Asereth, since the 21st of Tishrei, the 7th of October, some people are waking up, a little bit at least. So I just was actually reading an article about this, how certain people have changed their views, their opinions, their attitudes in recent weeks, in some cases over the last months or years, but in some cases just over the last few weeks. So I began by saying that I've been aware of the situation for 4 decades. And, it has been and continues to be difficult to see how many people there are, particularly Jews, who don't see reality.